Hi, and welcome to our discussion about how to recruit general practices for research. I'm Jenny McIntosh and I'm here with Kitty Novi. So between the two of us, we work at the Department of General Practice in Melbourne, and we've recruited thousands of patients and also hundreds of general practice clinics into research. So when you're actually writing your grant and you're wanting to involve general practice in your recruitment, there are three different levels at which you might involve them. One is as a whole clinic. You might involve them as an individual unit, and often that's the actual unit of randomisation, in which case that's really important to have all the clinic members on board. The next level is actually recruiting individual GPs, and you may not need to recruit the entire practice. And the third level is actually recruiting general practice patients. Are you looking for rural people? Are you looking for young people? Are you looking for older populations? In which case you need to target those particular clinics that have those populations. And sometimes that means doing a survey via the ABS to see where there are locations with high populations of that demographic that you're after. It may mean that when you go to the clinic that you actually have to look in their patient records to check that they have enough people in that population that you're looking for.
The work I do before approaching a clinic is varied and important. It's a marketing thing. So our project has to be the project that they get hooked into as well. And that means having the right material, the right pitch, and something simple and direct to get that individual interested.
And we do very much follow the model of the pharmaceutical industry. We provide them with a lot of information. We make times to meet them at lunch times and bring them lunch and those sorts of things. But one of the questions we get asked a lot is, well, where do you find all these GP clinics to recruit from? My first study in 2005, I cut and paste names from the yellow pages, and I strongly advise against doing that. So what I would suggest is that you get in touch with some practice-based research network, and there are a lot associated with different departments of general practices at universities. Some people do this through the primary healthcare networks or a teaching and learning database through a university. There are sources of groups of general practices that people can actually approach, saying that you do want to approach GP practices that are also research naive.
I sometimes ring them up and say, look, we're doing a research project on a particular subject. Would you be interested in receiving some information about this? Then they'll say yes or no. And if they say yes, then we'll email them information. And by then I've already found out their name, when they work often, because sometimes you'll ask questions about how many doctors are there, how many full-time, part-time nursing staff, and do you have full-time or part-time GPs. And that way you get a little bit of a feel for the clinic if you don't know too much about it. Then you'll send the information out by email, and you usually give them about a week. And you always ask them, when's a good time to call? Is it appropriate to call on a Monday or a Friday? And what time, when do they work? And that makes them feel as if you're listening to them. Make sure you always just take good notes, listen, and be as positive and as, I suppose, as welcoming as possible.
So very often one of the first things we ask is, who would be the person who we could actually talk to about being involved in a research project?
Because you might make 40 calls in a morning, and everybody says no. And you must still feel energetic about the project.
Absolutely.
Because it can be really disheartening and extremely frustrating.
It's not unusual to get 10% of GPs that you ring, and so it does take persistence. And if you are feeling disheartened, it's always a good time to sort of stop and rethink and do something else, because it'll come across in your voice.
You hook into a particular person at a clinic, whether it's a practice manager or somebody that's really interested in your particular study, and you make yourself available. One, you email information out, you talk to them, you follow up once they get back to you.
And you have to be prepared for anything when you turn up to a general practice clinic. So we often put together a PowerPoint presentation, but you have to be prepared to show that on the computer to GPs as they come and go and drop in and out of the conversation, and still make it cohesive and comprehensive so they understand it. The important thing too is that if a GP is interested in the study and understands what they're doing, it's essential to get them to sign on the dotted line at the time, the consent form, so that then we can go ahead with the study.
Yeah. And I think the material has to be, you have to hook the the doctor in, and that doctor must know that you can also hook their patients in. So it's got to be as transparent for the doctor as for the patient. So your material has to be catering for a person that understands a particular illness, but also their patients who might not have that knowledge. So that's why it's important to be simple, direct, and they don't want to read 3 pages of plain language statement. Yeah. You've got to give them something really, really tangible in front of them that they can understand, agree to, and then sign up.
So one of the other things to consider when writing a grant is how you build in the incentives into your project methodology. Sometimes people use CPD points or money, and you need to make sure that you incorporate these things when you write the grant, particularly from a time factor. For example, if you're going to apply for CPD points or professional development points through the RACGP, you need to know when in the triennium for the RACGP that's going to happen. And the other thing is, if you're looking at financial incentives or gifts or even food, you need to put all of those things into your budget beforehand. Sometimes these incentives can be, you might want GPs to recruit, say, 700 patients for your study. So instead of saying you'll give 7 GPs $10 each, you'll give each GP $1 each for each patient that they recruit. So that is a double incentive. They're getting some money, but there's also an incentive to recruit more patients per GP, and it gives you a little bit of latitude as far as numbers of GPs that you can involve in your study, because you'll find some clinics you'll go to and you'll get 100 patients maybe, or you'll go and you'll get 10 GPs in a clinic. Other GP practices you might get 1 GP, and it's not fair to sort of, incentivise them differently. Most of the time through an ethics committee, they're not keen on us using the word incentive. So we talk about reimbursement. And there is this like-for-like process where if we are taking up somebody's time at lunchtime, we'll provide lunch. And we do reimburse for time for interviews and things like that. But at the most, it'd be $100 an interview. Sometimes we'll pay a clinic up to $1,000 if they really do a lot of work for us.
One of the things that we find in indirect incentives is when you're doing a project, and if you're doing a training project, that you use a whole practice approach to that. And that includes not only the GPs, but the admin staff, the nurses, counsellors, psychologists, anybody else that might be interested in your particular study. If your doctor's involved in a study, that means for that particular patient that they're caring about them. And that means that patient might become more interested in becoming a participant in your study.
I have done things where I've given gift vouchers to the nurses to spend on the clinic, as opposed to giving the incentive to the whole clinic, because then if it's a corporate clinic, it'll go up to head office and they won't actually see the rewards for the work that they've done. And I remember one clinic, a practice manager went out and bought pillowcases for all of the clinic rooms because they really needed them, but they just didn't have that money in their budget from head office. With our latest project is we've actually made our nurses authors on the papers, and they were much more incentivised by that than by money. Most GPs and clinics do it out of a sense of that's the right thing to do. In fact, a lot of patients do that.
And if they have a really good experience with the project that you're doing, they will be involved in other projects if they're approached. And that's a really important incentive, that you've thought through your project so well, that you've got the right staff working for, that you make it as easy and as fluid as possible so they don't have to do extra work. They've got very little time often, and a project that runs well is a project that doesn't intrude on their time or their patients' time.
So I guess the golden rules are that you make sure that when you go into the clinic, you leave with them feeling positive about it. One thing that we often do is when we've finished a research project, we send a bunch of flowers. And the flowers sit on the receptionist's desk and the receptionists feel valued, because whenever you leave a clinic, you've got to make sure that they feel happy with the process, because While a GP practice has had a positive experience, we'll come back and do more research. A GP practice with a negative experience, you've lost them forever, and those GPs will travel to other clinics, and you will lose them too. And there's a very long memory with general practice.
Don't be disheartened if a practice takes a long time. I had a practice interested in my last project, and I signed them up in August. We have just completed, it's now June, their training. It took us that long to get the doctors all organised, to have the right day, the right time, the right month.
It's good to have a number of clinics on the go so that if one doesn't happen as quickly as you think it will, you'll have another one on reserve. So you're often playing this juggling act where you have a number of different clinics ready to go at once, and you have to sort of make sure that you get them on board as quickly, sequentially as possible. But you've always got to be thinking about the next clinic that you're going to recruit. Otherwise, you'll find that if you have a gap, then it just really messes up your whole sort of momentum for your study. You'll get a lot more out of a clinic that has more doctors than a solo GP, and generally a solo GP has less capacity and less extra time for research. So we do tend to use clinics that have at least 2 or 3 GPs.
And quite often a clinic will say, look, we've got a slot in 3 months' time for you to come out and present your project. Now that's a long time for a project. So you do that, but at the background, you should be looking at other clinics at the same time. And so quite often clinics only allow people to come out once a month. The research projects aren't their main interest. It really is a luxury. Clinics are quite different. They're often smaller. They're very, very connected to their local community. So doing research in a rural clinic could be a bit tricky because the practice staff, the doctors, all know the patients, and they often know them quite well, and they often know their extended family. They take a lot more time to recruit. They're often very keen to do research because they often feel that they're neglected, but recruiting them financially and also sort of logistically can be quite problematic.
Western Sydney, for example, can often take 2 planes or a plane and a hire car, and then you turn up to the meeting and they say, look, it's not a good time, could you come back tomorrow? And you do get a very different type of clinic. You get a lot of different information. It's quite a different scene, but it's really important to include them in your sample of GPs. It costs money to hire cars, pay for accommodation, meals and flights. So you have to also make sure you factor that into your budget too. So that's it from us.
That's it from me.
Thank you.
Thank you.